Hello, everyone. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live about negotiating a long-term agreement. I have the pleasure to have with me today Alessandro Comerci, a friend, a colleague, and a negotiation expert. So, really delighted to be there. And this gives me even the extra boost of energy because yesterday I had my second vaccine dose. So, I felt a bit weak today, a bit didn't sleep so well. But, the fact of being here with you, with Alessandro, that's a great source of energy. Now, I'm going to ask Alessandro to introduce himself, but before, I want to know more about you, the participants that are with us today. So, how about telling us from where are you connecting? I have the pleasure to have a connection, I believe, from 148 different countries. Now, will be interesting to see from where are you connecting today as you join us for this LinkedIn Live, so that it gives us a feeling about the representation that we have. Now, my guess is that, with two Italian living in Switzerland, maybe there would be a good amount of people that either are Italian or Swiss, but I'm sure that there are other persons that are joining us. Oh, my friend Bhavesh from Singapore, delighted. Okay, and a former colleague of both of us, Bhavesh, a CEO in Singapore. What a pleasure that you are with us, Bhavesh. Then Douglas from Germany, Angela from Italy, Alexandra from Geneva, Ryan from the Philippines. Okay. Silvio from Italy, from Turin. Then we have Wetonu, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, from France. Then again, Anil from Switzerland, Yeban from India, and Samuel from Switzerland. Okay, Switzerland, Rafael, Ali from South Africa. Will from US. Thank you, Will, for waking up so early for you. I know that you're making an extra effort to be with us. Amazing. And Egil from Basel. And okay, great. Delighted to see a very broad representation of people that are joining us today from different countries. Now, let's get started with our chat. And I will ask Alessandro to introduce himself so that we can understand a bit more about his background.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Hello, everyone, and my evening, afternoon, whatever. I'm very thrilled to present to such a diverse group. So thank you for making the time. Some of you very late, some of you very early. My name is Alessandro Comerci. I've been in procurement now 20 years, actually, in September. And I've been working in multinational companies primarily, mostly Americans, in Procter & Gamble for a long time. Met many of you guys as well there. And then to Coty for 5 years, leading global chemicals, and now recently into Herbalife in contract manufacturing. And well, I live in Switzerland, married, 2 little girls, twins, and I'm Swiss and Italian. You can hear it from my accent, so we'll keep it consistent with Giuseppe today. Nice to see you all.
Yes, if you're not able to cope with Italian accent, then I'm afraid that's not the right LinkedIn Live for you. Now, thank you very much, Alessandro, for this introduction. I mean, the topic is negotiating a long-term agreement. So let me start. But what do you define a long-term contract?
It depends, the lawyers will tell you. No, generally is a contract that runs longer than 3 years. The ones I had the experience to lead negotiations for or inherited or lived through go between 5 and 10 years. So these are what we would find most commonly into the business world nowadays. It's 3 to 5 years will be the most common length of contracts. Then there are those that you don't know you have. Everybody probably had in their life, but until somebody in finance or somebody in legal or compliance discovers there is a so-called evergreen contract, that's normally a very long-term contract that has been running for years, but nobody knows until they read it. But that's kind of probably not the subject of today's conversation, but watch out for those two. They can be very long and non-compliant agreements sometimes.
Yeah, indeed. And how frequently and in what occasion one uses long-term contract based on your experience?
Look, I spanned very quickly 20 years of procurement experience and making contract. They're not very common. They are not, especially nowadays. Companies are very skeptical, especially when negotiating pricings. Nobody wants to lock pricing with the uncertainty, the volatility there is. So they're not so common. However, when you work in companies that have the relationship that go beyond a year or two or three or a one-off type of project, that's where I saw the most common agreement of three types, essentially. R&D collaboration agreement will be one. So joint development for a new molecule, a new product, or a new service, engineering services. These are by nature very long contracts. It takes 2-3 years to develop a molecule. There's no point in having an agreement for a year and then we'll review it every year. So R&D agreement will be certainly very common. Then you've got what I actually happen to do quite a lot is outsourcing contract for make versus buy decisions. So you decide to outsource something. So you had a factory, it's underutilized, and you want to sell it, to give it to somebody that can run it more efficiently than you, bring other customers. These are very typically, nobody does that for less than 5-year commitment or contract. So what I did is 5 and 6 years, but they very typically go up to 10 years because there is hundreds of people involved in the deal. The factory is being sold involves lots of workers, unions, agreements, etc., etc. That's the second type I've seen. And then you've got the contracts that are for unique IP, intellectual property, protected materials, where it's actually a very important need of a company to secure supply. And regardless of the price of the moment or the price of the commodity or whatever it happens, it's critical for a company to secure the supply over a long time frame because the survival of the product or the business strategy itself depends on the product. So these are the three types of agreements or long-term agreement I've seen. There are many others in other industries, but where I work, these are the three most common ones.
Great. I mean, we understand, those three different components. Now, what do long-term agreements have in common?
There's one overarching theme in a long-term agreement. All of them have two parties which recognize the importance and the need and the desire of mutually beneficial agreements over a long period of time. So strategic alignment is what's in common in every single long-term agreement. And this is where you will hear it from me. But strategic alignment is always starting from a strategy. Do I partner with somebody who has the same vision, same objective, same strategy as me, as a company, as individual, or whatever your business is? If the answer is yes to that, then there is room to finding a long-term agreement. If the answer to that is no, then, well, just go back to square one and start from scratch. So strategic alignment is the number one common theme across all long-term agreements.
Great, thank you. We use this three questions, to set the basis, to understand a bit more how the thing. Now, let's get more into the negotiation part. By the way, I remind you that you can ask any question you want. So, I can continue to ask questions to Alessandro, but, if you do have something that you wanna, you have a doubt that maybe you want to share some of your experience or whatever, the chat is open for you to make any question that you have. Now, let's move to the negotiation side. I mean, what advice would you have for anyone who wants to negotiate a long-term contract?
Okay, I have a patronizing answer. Do your homework. Do your homework. I mean, I'll be more specific. Preparation is essential before entering discussions of a long-term agreement. Now, I'll break it down in a few essential elements. It goes back to strategic sourcing methodology. Many of you work in procurement, so they know, and you know, that you always start from the understanding of your business needs, your company's business needs at the highest possible level and at the mid to long-term strategy of the company. That's the number one starting point for you. You need to understand what you're after, what your company needs. Then you start looking outside. That's what we do in procurement. You map the market, you study the industry. You need to become the worldwide expert in whatever market that you're buying, whatever service, whatever product. Industry analysis, supplier analysis are essential. That's what I call part of the homework. You need to be the master when you recommend you want to have a doctor that has studied all possible diseases. When you go and they give you a diagnosis, you need to be the doctor for your business. You need to absolutely be the expert that can tell for sure that what is out there is meeting the company needs. Then is the mapping exercise. It's a little bit like in a mapping and matching, but it's like are the companies we saw, the suppliers we saw aligned? Do they have the same strategic goals long term? And that's the moment where you can start ticking the boxes and saying, well, I'm almost there, and it's really important to them that I work with these guys, and it's really important to me that I work with these guys. And that's where you start mapping and matching the needs of your company at the long term and the strategic intent of the other company. If the two align, that's where you have the likelihood of a long-term agreement. So my do the homework really is try to identify those overlapping needs, but it starts by understanding your own and understand the other company's needs and strategic intents. And very often it happens at the highest levels of a company, talking to their CEOs, CFOs, and really getting their vision and where you fit within their customer portfolio. This would be my first tip or set of tools before you even consider having an agreement.
Okay, great. I mean, you already give us, some interesting guidelines, strategic fit, where do we fit as a customer for them? What are some of the other challenges when negotiating a long-term agreement, and what will you recommend?
Now, it reminds me of my long days negotiating. These contracts are complex. They are not easy to write. So probably the advice number one I have for anybody, not just get a good lawyer that speaks good English or your language ideally, but the number one advice is keep it simple. Keep the language of the contract simple is the rule number one, for multiple reasons. Very likely at the end of the contract, you won't be there to renegotiate the contract. All of us change assignment every 3 to 5 years, probably, some even long, shorter. So the language in the contract needs to be easy to understand by anybody, stakeholders, companies, CFOs, CEOs. Read the clause and say, yeah, I get it. That's what these guys agreed. So keep it simple, rule number one. The second challenge when you negotiate is that we try to predict every possible outcome or every possible scenario that may happen over a 5 or a 10-year period. Now, if we were very good at predicting scenarios, we wouldn't do procurement jobs. We'd be somewhere else making millions. But it's our job to try and nail down the scenarios. But my advice is let's not overcomplicate and make contracts which are 150 pages that list every possible scenario that can happen, because nobody would have guessed COVID either. But rather agree principles of how you two companies can resolve any conflict that may arise. This could be a commercial conflict, it could be a legal conflict, it could be a force majeure. Listing out what are the steps we would take, what do we do, and what are the principles which make sense and are pragmatic. Then you write them down. And it's okay to write down principles in a contract, because it's better than trying to predict 150 possible scenarios, which basically drives the contract negotiation to many years. And that's probably what the nations do. Nothing against the United Nations people, but that's why negotiation take 30 years. They never had a contract. They try to predict everything. Challenge number 3, and I'll keep it to 3, but there are many more. Everybody has a say in a long-term agreement because they are so important and so strategic. Your CFO has a say on what the terms are. Your CEO has a say on the relationship and the quality of the relation with the supplier. Your supply chain VPs or senior executive, absolutely, I want to have my KPI. Everybody has a say in a long-term agreement, especially when you buy a product or a service, and especially an outsourced service. Now, what is that I suggest people to do is go back to your stakeholders and align again on the strategy. And if they're not clear, then align them to the strategies. Once they're clear what the strategy is, the negotiation strategy is, then you align what I call the negotiation mandate. Everybody needs to have a negotiation mandate. In this agreement, it's even more important to agree what are the boundaries, what can I negotiate, what I cannot negotiate, and then align roles and responsibilities. I need to be the negotiator and the face in front of that guy. Now, if I need in very complex deals a team, which is okay, sometimes you need it because it's not easy to sell a factory and do the deal by yourself. You need your factory HR leader because there's a lot of people discussion involved and you're not an HR expert. Then my advice would be to select a very small team of core participants to this negotiation and align the roles for each. And everybody, like an actor, needs to stick to the script and stick to the mandate. This keeps away the zillions of stakeholders that all the time try to influence what you're negotiating, and it drives towards conclusion of the deal. So this would be probably the 3 major challenges that I faced while negotiating long-term agreements.
Yeah. And I like, by the way, this idea about the preparation and the execution. I mean, in the preparation, the more people you involve, the better it is, because then you're going to get the perspective of the different functions, the different senior stakeholders, and then you understand what is value for the company. In the actual negotiation, keep the team short, right? The more the team is big, the more likely you are to end up having somebody that doesn't respect the role and mess it up. If I may, often my experience, the people that do not respect the roles may be the more senior executives, right? Maybe a more junior person is more likely to accept that okay, the role is a minor one, and that they are there as note taker and body language observer, etc. When you bring it to the negotiation, one of the more senior executives, then to be able to frame them and make them respect the script is more of a challenge, right?
Another advice: do not bring your senior executives to such negotiations. Align them up front and bring them to dinner,
Exactly.
but not at the negotiation table. That's my experience. They want to have a role, but it's a dinner role or it's a facilitation role outside of the negotiation table.
Absolutely. We do have the first question from the participants. Will you give an example when you pointed the principal list for crisis?
I want to be sure that I understand the question a bit better, because I'm not 100% clear. I want to give you a proper answer. If you could reformulate it, or
maybe Ali, indeed, we may not have the same understanding about what you mean. So why don't we take the next question from Siddharyu, and then we're going to go back to Ali, as he's going to tell us a bit more about what he has in mind. Can you please give any tips for long-term agreement with original equipment manufacturers?
Yeah. So OEMs, it's very often this long-term agreement come out of a decision, which is a strategic decision. So I go back to my tip number one, which is make sure that your supply chain organization, manufacturing organization is absolutely aligned to the make or buy decision. Okay, this is what essentially boils down to. When you deal with OEMs, there needs to be a decision of your company to buy something versus making something, because there is some strategic reason to do it. Technology, either there is a commodity that needs to be leveraged, or better efficiency of the assets, etc. But align that. So that would be tip number one. On the OEMs, my other tip would be you put your buyer's hat. You need to understand their business model and where you fit. I mean, it's super critical to play the reverse and put yourself in the shoes of the OEMs and say, what is the reason why I would want to work with this company? What is it that I can offer? Because it's, again, the OEM's word is out there to serve multiple and many, and they've got their customer, they've got their strategy and their portfolio. You need to see and understand where you fit in that customer portfolio. I have seen deals not going very well because some OEMs wanted to enter a space where they were not the strongest, or they wanted to just have a company name, and they started offering services where they were not their core activity, and it went very, very badly. So, this would be the two: look inside your own strategy and business, and then look outside and see where you fit. It's pretty much the same advice I gave before, but this would be really the essential steps.
Yeah. Okay, let me move to a question of mine, because so far we talked about companies where there is a strategic alignment, there is a common vision, etc. But how about when there is not a persistent relationship, there is no trust, but you're dealing with the company that is the only one that can provide a product or service, the typical single source supply type of situation. They are the only one that meets your long-term business needs. So
Giuseppe, this is the difficult question that you had to keep in your pocket. It is the difficult one. So let me challenge it. So the very first thing I do before, as a procurement professional, I'm put into the situation of sourcing single source, or being put in front of this is what we need and this is the only supplier. I would challenge that in a very positive way, which means go back to your industry, to your market, and to your strategy, and really, really ensure that that product, that one technology, whatever is that is single source, is exactly what you need, and ensure that you don't have an alternative to meet your business needs. So the very first thing, you put your business hat before you enter the negotiation hat and get excited about it. Challenge your business stakeholder to find and justify and document that this is absolutely the unique choice that is going to meet our business needs and our business strategy. So that's the number one challenge. The second thing is you never want to be in a single source situation as a buyer. So what do buyers do when they are single source? They look for alternatives. Now, the alternative may not be, it's protected by intellectual property, so you can't copy, but there are alternative ways, technical solutions to meet the same or solve the same problem. So having a BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement, so that's what we call it in technical jargon, go find a BATNA for yourself or your business, because it is not ideal to negotiate in a single source situation where your position of power is nil, you buy at the terms of the supplier. The third one is when you don't have a BATNA, consider strategically long-term to build it yourself. So either invest in the technology, invest in the manufacturing equipment, invest into the product development yourself. Worst case, consider a licensing deal, which is better than a licensing and buying a product and manufacturing a service agreement. Sometimes it's better to just buy the idea and make it yourself over the long run. It's longer, it takes a lot of money and investment, but it may be the right thing to do for your business if you want it the right way. The quality of standards, the quality of service you find out there in the supplier world, especially in innovative startups, especially in companies that are coming up with the new fantastic biotech developed chemical, they have no clue and no hundreds of experience in how to scale it up if you need thousands of tons. So these are the strategic consideration you need to do in such a unique IP proprietary material. And that's what I would actually suggest you do. Don't try not to end up in a situation of single source, but if you do end up, have an exit plan. This would be even a long-term exit plan. This would be my advice.
Yeah, and just to make it more concrete, share a couple of examples from my experience at P&G. Both Alessandro and I worked at P&G. One of the situations we had was that we were making a bleach manufacturing in a number of developing countries. Typically bleach is a product that is cheap and is sold in developing countries. So our factory was often in remote places where there was not a big local infrastructure. Now, when you buy the bottles to make the bleach, that you're going to put the bleach, an empty bottle cannot travel very much. So you cannot make a bottle travel 1,000 kilometers. And of course, often we ended up, maybe with only one company that could satisfy our needs. One of the things we did was start making our own blow molding machine. Let's say, doing the bottles ourselves, so that when we identified that the condition were not right, they were not competitive conditions, then we started, to make the bottles ourselves. But, if I look at another background, my pharma background as well, also, you may have a contract manufacturer that can do something, but maybe your own plants can also do some of the products. So then depending on how the things go, you may decide to go to the contract manufacturer 100% of the volume, 80% or 60%, depending on how they behave, or depends on the capacity availability in your own manufacturing plants. So yes, those things do happen in real life. Let's go back for a moment to Ali, because he wrote this question, it was about, the writing principle rather than the scenario. Can you elaborate a bit more on this? Yeah.
Yes, Ali, thank you so much for rewarding. Now I'm kind of the principles. I'm clear. The guidance in the contract. There's actually one for conflict resolution, which is a very standard one. Very often companies refer to, if there is a conflict, if we can't agree, instead of agreeing to disagree, we go to the International Chamber of Commerce terms and conditions for dispute resolution. That's a very, very, very common one. So how do you agree to resolve a dispute over whatever topic that may happen that is commercial? That's one of those, for example. When it comes to, I'll tell you one that I used in a contract manufacturing agreement where volume was related. Every buyer hates to negotiate fixed terms, commitments of volume. You never know 5 years from now what your business is doing, what the consumers want. You don't know what COVID happens or hits. So rather than putting penalties which are actually prefixed today, where you don't actually know what it will be in 5 years from now, you can agree a principle, and this was one that we've done, that beyond a certain threshold, then the parties will have to sit down and agree at least 12 months in advance how to restructure the site, what would be the pre-negotiated packages you would give to the workers to reduce the redundant workforce that you have in case of low capacity, and then you pre-agreed what would be the parts of the fixed cost that would benefit in case your volume goes up. So you only agree the principle, you can't agree precisely the price. Why? You don't know what your SKU, your bottle will look like 5 years from now. It may have a different shape, may have a different speed. So what you can agree is you pre-agreed what are the variables, so fixed costs, variable cost terms, how you tackle them, and how you treat them also from a monetary point of view, rather than agreeing a price, which would be virtually impossible. So those would be two examples, one on more general terms and another to be a lot more specific. If you are the subject matter expert, which I said you should do, like be like your doctor, you should know the cost components and the should cost of your product, and you build around those principles. That's how you have cost models applied as well into long-term contracts. So that's another very typical principle. It's a cost model which fluctuates with variable feedstock, for example, which are publicly traded in the stock, this given material stock exchange, etc. So this would be 3 examples I have for you, Ali.
Great, Alessandro. Let's take another question from Joy. Alessandro, can you describe a successful long-term agreement negotiation you had in the past?
That's a very interesting one. Joy, you started this one, and Joy, working closely with me 5 years ago. I think the core list supply agreement for fragrances is one of the best, most comprehensive and most successful contract we have negotiated. Not only because it was only very much in favor of the buyer, we were very successful, but also because even now, after many years, the principle we set out, the collaboration, the rules are living through that contract. And yes, the business didn't go very well, but this is to me the measure of success, even in a business turmoil where fragrances, guys, the past 2 years didn't sell very much. The partnerships are there, the principles are there, and the collaboration continues. Not easy, I'm sure. But this is probably something that we couldn't foresee 4 years ago when we wrote it. And this was a 5-year agreement. So to me, success looks like these contracts can live the bad weather and the good weather, and they're still there today and ready for, doing business together.
Great. Maybe let me build on the question from Joy. How about, do you experience a significant issue in a long-term contract? Can you give a real life example, right? We talked about a successful one. How about?
I have to be honest, right? Yes, of course. It was a major outsourcing contract, and again, it's like the companies of the, I've only really worked for 3 companies, so you can guess, but there is nothing confidential in what I'm saying. Yes, there were contracts in the many M&A activities that P&G did, then Coty, which were either handed over to me or passed on. And one of these long outsourcing contracts where I sold the factory to an OEM manufacturer, it was a 6-year deal where basically, it was one of these very difficult deals. Within the company, it had a strategic alignment, a purpose, an MPV, and a rationale and a reason to exist. And all the terms were written according to it. Well, the company merged with another one and became another company. And suddenly the needs and the shorter term needs and the vision and the different demands of the new leadership of the new company changed overnight. And guess what? To complicate things even further, I ended up working for the new company. So I'm not the one that says, okay, I wash my hands clean and I hand it over. I ended up being there and being, even if I wasn't directly responsible for that area, I was asked constantly, why was this agreed? Why did you ever even sign a contract like that? It's like, well, then this is a very difficult situation. The business didn't go well, and I found myself to face a new leadership and a new company that actually didn't think this contract was such a good idea, not even the way it was written. So that's not a very pleasant scenario, as you can imagine. And the business didn't go well either, so it didn't make it easier.
Okay, well, but then tell us a bit more. I mean, it's a very interesting situation, but how did you manage this rather delicate situation? Within the terms of confidentiality, let's say, right? I don't want to break confidentiality, but what can you share with us?
Look, I changed assignment. No, jokes apart. I was in another assignment. Now, I went back to the principles I've been talking about for the past half hour. The very first thing I did, I ensured that the new management of the company understood the strategic rationale for doing this contract, the benefits, why we did it, how we did it, and that to be very honest, in the long run, this is beneficial, but they only see it after 6 years. The only thing that they didn't agree very much is, why do I have to wait 6 years? I want to break the contract now. So that's one of those cases where you have to remind how the longer term picture and the strategy. So you always go back to strategy, because that's the only thing the CEOs understand. The COOs, the CPOs, strategy is what people understand. So you go back to strategy. And that's the advice number one. And then guess what? Those simple principles, not the 100 scenario, but those principles, how do you deal with the volume dropping? Now, yes, you may end up paying a lot of penalties, but if you go back to the principles, then you read again how to collaborate. How did we agree 3 years ago to collaborate? And then you read that, and it builds common ground where, well, any new management just reads the contract. And by the way, that's why we write contracts, is to avoid that there is changes and culture in people in negotiation. The terms and the principles are agreed. So you go back to them and you just go through and read them again with your new manager, with your new counterpart, and find a common solution. Last but not least, because I had to keep a job, you try to find something that you can negotiate in the contract. You need to have some small wins here and there. You can renegotiate something in a long-term contract. It's okay to renegotiate. In the end, that's what we do. We're negotiator. So find the thing that is not so strategic or so vital that you can negotiate. Your penalty, how you implement it, when you implement it, how can you compensate, what other businesses can you give them. So you find something that you can negotiate to mitigate the impact of a contract, which you couldn't foresee 4 years before. So,
yeah, and let me give another example that comes into my mind. I inherited a contract, a 5-year contract that was negotiated by my predecessor, and it was a 5 years take or pay agreement. So, the market was very tight, and my colleagues, in order to secure the product, had agreed for a take or pay contract that, whether we need it or not, he will buy a certain quantity of product. And guess what? A couple of years later, when he left and I came in, we realized that, the business was not quite going so well like marketing had anticipated, and we only needed, 70% of what we had committed. So then I had, as a new person, without having the relationship, go there and renegotiate the terms of the contract. So I guess, one message is, do make an effort, to build the relationship, to connect with people, meet them physically, etc., etc. And then the other is a give and take, right? You cannot just say, okay, listen, we promise you 100, we are only going to buy 70, sorry. Maybe you say, okay, we're going to buy 70, but we're going to extend the contract, and then we're going to continue the relationship for 2 more years, but at a different kind of volumes, just to oversimplify the matter.
Thank you, Giuseppe, for the reminder of one thing which I forgot to say. Perhaps the most important of the half an hour: be yourself, bring your ethics with you, your integrity, and your best values. And no matter what hat you're wearing, what company you're working for, when you deal with third parties, your integrity and your values come with you. Your behavior is dictated by your personal integrity, professionalism, and value. These 3 things are the only 3 things that survive any relationship and any length of contract. The rest come and go. I've changed it 4 CPOs, 3 CEOs, and 4 CEOs in 4 years. Your principles remain. Be yourself, stick to it, because this is what pays out in the long run as a procurement professional with third parties. If there's one thing to remember, this is it.
Thank you, Alessandro. Let's take, we are about, let's take one last question maybe, and let's see what Alexander is suggesting. When you're negotiating long-term service agreement for different locations in different countries and try to choose one supplier, what advice could you give?
The first one I have, Alexander, is to make sure that this one supplier is present in all the countries, the best in all the countries, and has the best terms in all the countries. If the answer is yes to that, then you have no difficulties in negotiating this deal. But it goes back to strategy, Alexander. Is there one provider in the world that can meet your services needs everywhere at the same level everywhere? If the answer is yes, or if the overall value is good for the company, even if some countries have a suboptimal KPI performance, then it's good for the company. If the answer is no, and that supplier in a vital country that is strategic to your business cannot meet the needs, then you just carve out that contract and make it with somebody else. I don't advise entering deals with suppliers just because they need to be one, or somebody tells you that it needs to be simple and we only work with one global outsourcer. Well, you are there to meet business needs, not to simplify suppliers to the least possible number. So I don't know if I answered that, but go back to the strategy and see whether this is the right supplier that can meet your local needs everywhere at acceptable levels.
Let's take, we have a few more questions. Let's go for it. And as I said, if you have questions, feel free to take the opportunity. Where will you absolutely favor long-term agreement over a mid-term with agreed extensions options?
I sound like a broken record. If the companies are strategically aligned, I don't see a difference of going mid or long, except some of the terms, like the price, needs to be reviewed. But there is no difference. I'm for efficiency, and I ask my teams to go for efficiency. Wherever you can have a longer term, which agrees the generic terms, then I'm happy to make compromises on how often I adjust the price within the contract, but at least I don't have to renegotiate 85%, 95% of the terms. My preference for efficiency reason, yes, go longer. Be aware that certain variables cannot be fixed for so long. So so that's where you do interim extension just for those parts that need to change.
Great. Let's listen to this other question. How important is to understand the counterparty's culture when negotiating long-term agreement? Does this play an important role in how to bridge any cultural gaps?
I have one example come to mind. I've done many deals with Japanese, and at the time I was in Procter & Gamble, was over probably 10, 15 years ago, and we were using US/UK based suppliers for a certain material. But the market got tighter, and guess what? There were this Japanese company that served mostly Asian companies, and there was no relationship. Now, it's absolutely critical to understand that I don't go as a newcomer and just the new person shaking a hand to a Japanese company and they lay out the carpet for a long-term deal. It actually took probably 2 to 3 years to get to know them, to align them, to show them that you give them business, you agree the terms that are acceptable to them, you live up to building the relationship, and only then, and I can even give you how well this served me, this building relationship. 10 years later, I found them again, and I was in charge at Coty of chemicals. Guess what? I was the most welcome person because I started that relationship in P&G 10 years before, and they are still a supplier. So you need to be prepared. It takes time in certain culture to gain the trust, more than in any other, Japanese being one of those, but it's absolutely clear to understand the modus operandi of this type of cultures when negotiating long-term deals. For some of them, no go. But this is
let me share a failure of mine, just to give the other perspective. It was the beginning of my career. I've been working in procurement for a couple of years, and I was doing my first global tender and first round the world trip. So I was going to meet different suppliers in Brazil, US, Mexico, Japan, Europe, etc. And I remember my boss, with all good intention, to telling me, listen, Giuseppe, we are an ethical company, so make sure that you treat the supplier in the same way so that, we don't make a difference between one and the other. But guess what? If I treat in the same way a Brazilian supplier versus an American supplier versus a Japanese supplier, am I really doing the right thing? Probably not, right? So these are the kind of things that, the mistakes that you make at the beginning of the career. And then when you realize that things do not quite work the same way, that maybe in certain culture decisions are taken at the negotiation table, in other culture decisions are taken before or after in a consensus kind of culture, etc., then you may realize that, treating your supplier in the same way may not be the best approach when you're dealing at an international level. Let's listen to another procurement professional, Dagmar. In your opinion, what is the maximum duration for a price agreement, assuming price formula, you would recommend?
Dagmar, this is the $1 million question. I'll tell you my answer, which is the one is whatever the seller is willing to accept is the best and maximum length that you can ever negotiate, because it all depends on your needs. If you're able to lock it and have a 5-year deal and the seller doesn't mind because they are selling you a byproduct, just go for it. The longer you can to meet your needs with a good profitable situation for you, then the better. I don't have a magic wand on 1 or 2. Very typically, when there is a formula, The only thing you need to look a bit more seriously, if you take all your chemicals, or if you take something that is derivative of a feedstock that can change over time, you need to know your industry. Because if one day you're sourcing oil from Palm, Malaysia, and the next day there is a change in legislation somewhere in the world that forbid that, and you need to switch to some other source of feedstock, then you don't want to have your contract linked to that oil. So you need to know your market and what are the feedstock you're tying yourself up to. If you're buying corn or other commodities, you need to understand that over time, the food policies of the countries may change. This is very critical. Don't lock yourself in an index that you can regret later on, but keep it within a predictable time frame. So probably 2-3 years, but 5-10 years, and feedstock, you don't know. You really don't know. So I would refrain from that if you don't have the certainty on the feedstock market.
Perfect. Alessandro, thank you very much for this insightful exchange. My key message that I want to leave with participants, that you convey as a message, as a professional, procurement, sales, merger and acquisition, alliance management, whatever is your function, remember your integrity, your values, your principle, your credibility. These are the elements that are going to make you succeed over time. And I hope that that's something that you want to keep in mind from this discussion that can help you to be more effective in the future. So thank you again. All the very best to you all for joining us for this session, and look forward to see you again. Our LinkedIn Live take the summer break, so we are not going to have LinkedIn Live in July and August. We look forward to reconnect with you in September to continue the learning journey together. Thanks again, Alessandro. Thanks again to everyone. All the very best. Enjoy your summer.
Bye-bye.